Welcome to another edition of Incense Magic. In this video, we're going to take a look at different types of molds that you can use in incense making, some ways to use those molds, and even a few troubleshooting tips. Now, molds are amazing tools for making all kinds of interesting and really unique forms of incense, but they're also great for making kind of more traditional shapes like sticks and cones, so they're great for that too. But the best part of all is that you usually don't even need a mold that's made specifically for incense. You can use almost any mold that's designed for clay or soap or baking or candy making or just about any other use. So get ready to make some very different forms for your incense. That's coming up on this episode of Incense Magic. Molds come in about any size or shape that you can imagine. You can find them made of hard plastic, latex, silicone, even wood. The best thing is you can use almost any of these molds to make incense. Of course, one thing that you need to consider when you're selecting a mold is how that particular shape is going to burn. In most cases, if you use a good recipe, the incense itself is going to burn regardless of the shape that you use. But many push molds are basically a rectangle or a circle with a figure added in the center or on top. And it really is the shape of the base of that incense that's going to have the biggest impact on how it burns. Now, molded incense with a base that's square or round burns very differently than those that are long and narrow. A large round or square incense, when you light it in just one spot, it tends to grow in every direction. So when it's first lit, it's going to emit a small stream of smoke, but once it begins to spread out into a wider area, it'll start to release more and more smoke. You might end up smoking yourself out of the room. A long, narrow piece tends to burn more evenly and with more predictable amount of smoke. But ultimately, as with everything else, it really is up to the incense maker to decide all of these details. Just make sure that you do give some thought to how a particular shape will burn before you start molding lots of incense in that form. Now, the most common type of mold found in craft stores and hobby shops is what's called a push mold. Push molds are one-piece molds that have a figure on one side and they're flat on the other side on the bottom. Push molds can be made of rigid material or flexible material. Incense that is made with a rigid plastic mold can be more difficult to unmold than those that are made with a flexible mold. But on the other hand, flexible mold, it is easy to distort the shape when you're filling the mold and while unmolding. Like most things in life, it is a trade-off. So I'll talk about how to deal with unmolding difficulties in a few minutes, including one of my prize secrets of molding incense. Now, another type of mold is the two-part mold. These are really nice because you aren't forced to have that flat bottom that takes up like half of the space of your figure. Although a lot of two-part molds do still utilize a flat bottom. A two-part mold can be really virtually any shape. There are still issues though with unmolding if the figure is too complex, if it's got pieces that are too thin. A two-part mold can create much more intricate pieces than a push mold, but keep in mind that, again, these molds really aren't made for incense, at least most of them. So even with a two-part mold, a flexible one, you may need to push incense in and into the mold before putting the two halves together. So you got to be careful not to overfill or push too hard or underfill when loading the mold. All of that can distort the shape just as you would with the flexible push mold. So it might take a little practice to use a complex mold. Now, there are a few molds on the market that are specifically made for incense, but don't get your hopes too high. Most of those molds are either poor imitations of the molds that are used in incense stamping machines for commercial incense making, or they're designed by wonderful skilled craftsmen who don't actually know anything about making incense. Now, if you hunt around, you might find one that you'll actually be able to use. Now, the molds we saw on our website were designed by professional incense makers, and they're made in-house. So I'm confident that you can use those for incense making. But some of the other commercial molds that are out there can be used if you don't mind a bit of extra work or handling a mold that is much heavier than it really needs to be. Now, before we take a closer look at some molds, I do want to mention the importance of making good incense dough if you plan to mold it. Now, if your dough is too wet, which is a common problem, it often becomes very, very sticky. If your dough is sticking to your gloves, it probably isn't ready for molding. Now, on the flip side, if you roll some of your dough and it's got cracks in it and it's got dry spots, that's not going to work well for molding either. So make sure that you have incense dough that is moist, doesn't crack, and isn't overly sticky. Now, there are tons of push molds available, and a lot of them can be used for incense making. Rigid push molds can be tricky to use, especially if your dough isn't the perfect consistency. It might be difficult to remove it from a rigid mold, but we'll talk about some tricks for that here in just a minute. But if you'll take a tour of your nearest craft store, what you'll find is aisles and aisles of different types of molds. The majority of those molds are rigid push molds. So if you can master using the rigid push mold, you'll be able to entertain yourself for decades to come with the huge variety of molds that are available right now, and more coming out every year. Now, there is another type of rigid push mold that isn't nearly as common, but they're great. They're often labeled as stamps, although they really fall somewhere between stamps and molds. You can roll some incense dough on your work surface, roll it out flat with a rolling pin, and then you can press one of these molds down into the dough. Now, you can use them like a traditional mold too and just push the dough into the end if you want to. Once you get it in there, then you see the clever part, which is the spring-loaded handle. Now, when you press on this handle, a piece inside of the mold not only stamps the top of your incense, but it actually pushes the incense out of the mold for you. It doesn't get much better than that. Now, if you roll your incense out flat, don't forget this. You can also use cookie cutters or cookie stamps in your incense making, but that's for another video. Now, in addition to rigid molds, there are lots of flexible molds. In past decades, these were often made out of latex, but in the 21st century, most of the flexible molds you're going to find are made out of silicone. Now, one of the great things about flexible molds is that you can reverse the mold, turn it inside out as a way to remove your incense. Now, you have to be very careful that as you do this, you don't smudge or damage the design of the incense or the shape as you reverse the mold. Now, most commercial incense is made using a rigid two-part mold. Some of these molds require you to load both halves of the mold and then press them together. I don't like that. Others are loaded with dough while they're closed, and then the mold is opened to release the incense so you can remove it. Now, I personally prefer the second approach. Really, unless I'm working on a project that requires incense that can only be made with a push mold or an open two-part mold. Now, admittedly, I don't mold incense nearly as often as I roll it by hand, but I still like doing it. It's a lot of fun. Now, once you've selected a mold and you've made your incense dough, it's finally time to make some incense. Now, for press molds, take a piece of dough and press it into the mold. I like to start with a large piece of dough pressed into the center of the mold, and then I'll work it with my thumbs and press the dough out from the center to make sure that I fill the mold completely and want to leave a little bit above the top of the mold. And that's because once the mold is filled, it's really a good idea to level the bottom of the incense before you unmold it. I just use a craft stick to scrape it level. Now, when using two-piece mold, in most cases, it's best to start with the mold closed, fill the empty cavities, and then open the mold to remove the incense. If the design of the mold that you're using won't let you load it when it's closed, just make sure that both halves of the mold are completely filled before attempting to press the two halves together. Really, it's usually a pretty good idea to overfill both halves And then once you've pressed them together and made the incense, you can trim off the excess. I like to use a sharp hobby knife to do this, but if you're careful, you can even use the pointed end of a toothpick. Now, speaking of toothpicks, these are really useful for eliminating air bubbles from your mold, among other things. Air bubbles can get trapped when you're loading incense into the mold. This is especially a problem for me when I'm using cone molds. Once you load your incense dough, you want to use that toothpick to pierce the incense and make a hole all the way through to the end. You can then press the dough again. It'll press down a little bit to make up for any trapped air that came out. So you may have to top it off a little bit and then reflatten it. You do have to do that if you got enough air out. Now, of course, a toothpick is also the perfect tool for making backflow cones, if you want to try that. If you want to turn your molded cones into backflow cones, the type that the smoke comes out of the bottom, use that same toothpick, make a hole right through the center like you did to release the air, but make certain you don't go all the way through to the tip. You need to leave that tip intact. Now, not only will this cause the smoke to flow down if you're using a backflow incense burner, but it also does speed the drying process up a little bit. Now, if you burn a backflow cone in a regular cone burner or a censer, it's going to burn just like a regular cone, so no harm in making them that way. So all of that looks pretty simple, doesn't it? Well, good things are rarely so simple. The number one problem people have with molds, regardless of type, is removing the finished incense from the mold. So I want to give you some critical tips for unmolding your incense. Now, this is all secret incense making knowledge. So I expect you to keep this information to yourself. Now, seriously though, this really is some information that could transform your use of molds in incense making. Now, there are 3 basic techniques to keeping incense from sticking in a mold. The first approach is borrowed from baking, but honestly it's my least favorite. You can dust the inside of your mold before you put the incense dough inside. Rather than dusting with flour like you would if you were baking, I would suggest that you use some of the base material that you used in your recipe for that incense blend itself. If your base material, for example, is primarily sandalwood, dust the inside of that mold with some sandalwood powder. If you used a cedar base, then dust the inside of the mold with cedar powder, etc. You get the idea. This can give your incense kind of an uneven look if you didn't completely evenly powder the entire mold, but that's not going to impact the scent or how it burns, just how it looks. Now, the second method is to wet the mold rather than dusting it. By swabbing the inside of the mold with water before you put your incense dough into it, it will almost always allow you to easily remove the incense from the mold. This will add some liquid to each piece of incense you make, so it's going to increase the drying time a little bit. But honestly, being able to easily unmold incense is definitely worth a few extra days of drying. Now, the third method only works with flexible molds. Now, this is another secret technique borrowed from the kitchen, so shh. Once your flexible mold is filled with incense dough and the bottom's been leveled off, you've gotten the air bubbles out, place the mold in your freezer. No, I'm not kidding. Freeze the incense in the mold for several hours. Freeze it overnight if you want to be extra cautious. Now, when you reverse the mold after the incense is frozen, the incense is going to come right out of the mold with absolutely no distortion. But if there were any air bubbles left in it, they're going to be really, really obvious. So just be aware of that. Now, this also makes nice smooth sides to your incense. As long as you're careful to avoid any of those nasty air pockets in your incense dough, freezing the mold, remember only with flexible molds, really does make it simple to remove the incense. Now, once you've removed frozen incense from that mold, set it on its bottom and let it come up to room temperature naturally. Now, as you do this, the incense might sweat a little bit through the process, but that's normal and it's not going to hurt anything. I should also mention, though, that you can use all of these same molding techniques that we've talked about for incense only using charcoal powder and a gum binder, so you can make charcoal. If you ever want to make your own charcoal for burning loose incense or for powdered incense or even making blanks, it's the exact same process as using the mold for incense. You can make incense blanks with charcoal, just mold them into cones or sticks, let them dry, and then you can take the dry blanks and soak them in any essential or fragrance oil to add scent. So there's a good overview of making incense with molds. Now, if you're an incense maker who's never tried molding incense, trust me, go find a mold or two and have a blast. It isn't the same experience as hand rolling sticks or cones, but you can get very, very creative with the thousands and thousands of different molds that are out there. Now, if you use a mold to make some super cool incense, please let me know. I'd love to at least see it, even if I can't smell it. So that's it for this edition of Incense Magic. If you've enjoyed this video, I hope you'll subscribe to my YouTube channel. I also hope that you'll visit our website, theincensedragon.com, where you're going to find all sorts of incense making ingredients and supplies and tools. If you don't feel like making incense yourself, of course, you can also buy some pre-made incense on our site. So thank you for watching. Until next time, bright blessings.